Mount Everest, Origin and First Notice. I remember, in the slow geometry of an empire mapping itself, how a distant peak stepped into global knowledge and became the measure of the world. Local peoples had names and stories for the mountain long before any European surveyor turned an instrument toward it. It took the great trigonometrical survey to bring that mountain a single global identity and a single staggering claim. It was the highest point on Earth. The peak that would be popularly called Mount Everest entered Western maps and imaginations as the result of systematic surveying by British surveyors who worked across the subcontinent and the Himalayas during the 19th century A. The tools and math that fixed its height, they did not climb to the top to measure it. They measured it from a distance with chains and towers and the patient precision of trigonometry. Baselines were laid out and measured with painstaking care. Towers rose where hills did not exist, and brass theodolites were mounted in heat and wind to measure tiny angular differences. From those angles and a known baseline, the surveyors constructed triangles that reached, in calculation, to the summits of inaccessible ranges. By measuring the elevation angles of far-off peaks and building vertical triangles, they turned the unseen into numbers and decided that this particular summit was the crown of the planet B. Naming and the weight of a name. Names carry authority. When the surveyors declared one peak the highest, the mountain acquired the name of Sir George Everest, though he never set eyes on its summit. The act of naming by colonial institutions made the mountain a global object and framed the challenge that would follow: to stand on a place whose height had been fixed by instruments, but whose top had not yet been stood upon by an outsider. The mountain ceased to be merely a local landmark and became a standard, a test, a magnet for stories of human ambition. The northward passages and early reconnaissance, early climbing and reconnaissance, approached Everest from the north because political geography had closed the south. The first expeditions were exploratory by necessity and by design. They brought caravans of porters and loads of equipment to high, thin places and attempted to understand the mountain as a system of ridges, glaciers, and weather patterns rather than as a simple vertical problem. Each survey party returned with more accurate maps and the names of passes and features that would become waypoints in later attempts. Maps improved slowly from hand-drawn sketches to measured triangulation, and the mountain's contours began to make sense in the mind of the climbing world C. The era of high hopes and near misses. Once the mountain was mapped well enough to be approached with intent, the age of attempts began. Men who would be remembered for their courage set out into the ice and wind, only to be turned back by weather, avalanches, sickness, and the simplest human limitations. Some climbed to heights previously thought impossible, and then were stopped by thin air and bad luck. The mountain denied them with indifferent efficiency. The stories from these years are not all of failure. They are of learning. They taught climbers how to place ropes, where to build camps, how to ferry supplies upward slowly, and how to respect the way the mountain shapes and kills ambition. The Mallory Mystery and the Cost of Daring. In the first quarter of the 20th century, two names became a symbol of those early, tragic attempts: George Mallory and Andrew Irvine. They were seen high on the north face and then vanished into a weather front, leaving a question that would haunt the mountaineering world for decades. did they reach the summit before they died. The mountain kept its secret for a long time. When a body was found decades later, it offered pieces to a puzzle, but not the proof that would finally resolve whether human feet had stood on that summit in 1924. Their attempt is a study in the extremes of human hope, the limits of technology at the time, and the peculiar cruelty of a high, changeable mountain that looks indifferent even as it demands absolute respect. Technical advances and procedural learning. Each failed assault carried practical lessons. Climbers refined acclimatization practices, and oxygen use evolved from bulky novelty to standard equipment. Logistics improved as teams learned to stage their camps and manage loads. The relationship with local Sherpa communities deepened and became essential, not optional. Methods for establishing fixed ropes and ladders across crevasses became more systematic and reliable. The mountain's danger zones were mapped and remapped. High places that had once seemed impassable were rendered negotiable by repeated human effort and mechanical ingenuity. The ascent of Everest became less an individual dare and more a complex, coached operation that required the best of planning and stubborn endurance. The South opens and the final assault. Political changes finally opened a southern route, and with a new approach came fresh tactics and different conditions. The south side presented its own hazards and its own routes, but it brought climbers closer to the main summit ridge in ways the northern approach could not. A series of expeditions pushed ever farther up the southern slopes until the required combination of route knowledge, weather opportunity, logistical support, and human energy aligned. Each season the mountain yielded a little more to human determination and refinement of technique, until the day when two climbers combined all the accumulated knowledge and reached the top. The summit and what it meant. On a day of long preparation and brief daylight, two men reached the summit and stood where centuries of maps had pointed. Their success was the product of previous failures, of careful surveying, of improved equipment, and of an intimate knowledge of the route laid down by those who had come before. The summit is not an abstract number. It is a place whose precise elevation had once been the product of telescopes and trigonometry, and which finally became the place where human hands met the highest point on Earth. The moment changed the narrative of the mountain from an unassailable measure to a reachable objective, though it did not make the mountain humane. Aftermath and the long shadow. Victory on the summit did not end the mountain's dangers or its moral complications. It changed the rhythm of ascent and the scale of commercial interest. Everest became an axis of human drama, where triumph and tragedy continued in equal measure. The mountain's height remained a fixed number in textbooks and a fluctuating environment in reality. Climbers continue to come for reasons that range from personal pilgrimage to professional achievement. And to approach Everest is to accept a history of mapped knowledge, failed attempts, and a successful ascent that rests on the shoulders of every person who tried but did not reach the top. Conclusion of endurance and meaning. If Everest teaches anything, it is the compound truth that discovery, measurement, surveying, and eventual conquest are collective acts extended over time. The mountain was first fixed in the ledger of the world through instruments and math. It was studied by cartographers and surveyors who built the geometry that made it visible to planners and climbers. It tested early seekers until their failures became instruction. It raised questions about naming and authority, and about the price of ambition. Then, after years of learning and practical improvement, humans stood at its peak and understood that achievement is never a single,